Hey everybody, it is Monday. We're back with a new edition and a new week on this April 28th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Winunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to.
Moshe, and you are back in New York after a weekend hobnobbing with all of the political reporters that we all read, listen to, and watch. How was the weekend surrounding the White House Correspondents' Dinner?
Do you hear it in my voice, Jill?
Yeah, we're too old for schmoozing and boozing all night.
I was talking to a friend. It was like 1:45 in the morning on Saturday night at like one of the after events. NBC has an after event among several organizations. I was like, oh my God, like it's past 1 a.m. I don't know the last time I was out that late, but it was very enjoyable. As many of you know, I spent more than a decade in Washington, spent a lot of time, even when I was based in New York, covering things in Washington. This Correspondents' Weekend is an annual event that goes back like a century, but in recent decades, it's become this big thing with pre-parties and after-parties and celebrities. And typically you have, all the journalists who cover the president and the president. Now, for the last 2 Trump administrations, no president. Obviously, they've had a very contentious relationship. So, it was tradition. Republicans, Democrats all came to the dinner. Trump pulled out when he was president, and now he's back again, and they have no interest in making that dinner a thing because, Jill, there was the famous dinner during the Obama administration where Obama was mocking Trump. One of the inspirations for Trump running for president was like being like mocked to no end by the president at this, I think it was 2011 or 2012 Correspondents' Dinner. So anyway, there's a long tradition here with these dinners, but it's a larger weekend of stuff. So even though there was no president and not really, there were days where like it used to be like George Clooney and Larry David and, the cast of all the major shows used to come to this thing. This year, not so much. I think the most notable celeb was the dad from White Lotus, Jason Isaacs.
He was the big name.
He was the big name. And they used to have like used to like trip over Kerry Washington. Like that's what was happening back in the day. But, it's sort of back to basics for the media. We'll get into it more later in the podcast. But, it's very interesting because I was with like some MAGA parties, like Republican parties, where like they're on cloud 9 over there. And then I was at like some of the more traditional media parties where, there's a lot of concern about both the state of the business, but also the state of the relationship with the White House.
Well, you looked great, as did Lauren, who is our DC-based producer, and got to go to some of the parties with you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and it's a rare moment these days where I get to make use of my tuxedo and go black tie, Jill. So broke out the tux for the first time.
It still fits. That's the good news.
That's
You're
the
a dad, and
right.
It still fits.
It's still. I haven't had to open it up since my wedding several years ago, and so I take that as a. That honestly is the headline for me this weekend, Jill.
It's a win. It's a win, no matter what else happened over the weekend.
I didn't even try it on before the weekend. Like I didn't even, I threw it in the suitcase and hoped it would fit, and there we go.
I like the confidence. All right, to the headlines, starting off with the most recent escalation of the Trump administration's clash with the judiciary. The FBI arrested a Wisconsin judge on Friday for allegedly helping an undocumented immigrant to temporarily evade arrest and deportation. Overseas, a deadly explosion at Iran's largest commercial port over the weekend as Iran-U.S. peace talks continue. Plus, the Trump administration is reportedly planning for potential talks with North Korea. Here we go again.
Here we go, Lil' Kim.
In Canada, a deadly car ramming attack in Vancouver at a street festival. What police are saying about the suspect. Back in the U.S., ex-Congressman George Santos sentenced to more than 7 years in prison for fraud and identity theft over the weekend. His reaction.
It wasn't great, Jill.
And world leaders attend Pope Francis's funeral at the Vatican and hold some high-level meetings around the event.
Yeah, really fascinating image of Zelensky and Trump.
Moshe, we were just talking about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, a reporter calling out the media at the event, accusing them and himself of blowing the coverage of President Biden's decline. Plus, Moshe has on this day in history.
What Katy Perry says she did on this day 17 years ago. Your clue is she liked it.
Well, I don't think that it was going up on the Blue Origin rocket that basically ruined careers.
No, this is 17 years ago, Jill. We'll take you back to the yachts.
All right, let's start with some news out of Wisconsin, where a new front has been opened in the escalating battle between the Trump administration and the judicial branch regarding immigration cases. A Milwaukee judge, Hannah Dugan, was arrested by the FBI on Friday. She was charged with 2 federal felonies, obstruction and concealing an individual. She's been accused of helping an undocumented immigrant evade arrest by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, last week. On the day a hearing was supposed to take place in her courtroom, she faces up to 6 years in prison if convicted. So this all happened during a court appearance earlier this month for a 30-year-old undocumented Mexican national. His name is Eduardo Flores Ruiz. He faced 3 misdemeanor charges of battery and domestic abuse from a fight the previous month in which he allegedly punched another person 30 times after being accused of playing music too loudly. He was also accused of striking a woman who tried to break up the fight. He was in Dugan's courtroom on April 18th for a pre-trial conference for that case. During that hearing, Dugan was seen by multiple witnesses directing the defendant and his lawyer to leave through a private jury door instead of the public entryway, where she was anticipating that ICE agents were waiting to arrest him. Meanwhile, according to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the victims and state prosecutor were waiting inside of the courtroom. Flores Ruiz and his attorney made it outside of the courthouse, but he was quickly arrested after he tried to flee on foot. Dugan, the judge, was then arrested on Friday after an investigation into what happened. The Trump administration has said that they will investigate and prosecute those who do not cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, even in jurisdictions with policies that limit cooperation, like sanctuary cities.
So a few more details here from the federal criminal complaint. And this headline really struck a lot of folks on Friday, seeing federal officials arrest a judge here. According to the criminal complaint, we posted this over on the Instagram page on Friday. The judge learned that the immigration agents were waiting to arrest Flores Ruiz after his hearing, and she became visibly upset, according to multiple witnesses. Apparently, she approached the immigration officials in the hallway and asked them what type of warrant they had. She's like, "Do you have a judicial warrant signed by a judge?" They said, "No, we have an administrative warrant signed by an ICE official," which is a distinction. Administrative warrants don't authorize agents to enter private spaces like courtrooms, but they can be in public spaces like the hall. The judge said, "You need a judicial warrant to arrest him." They said, "No, we don't. We just need the administrative warrant." She said, "Well, I'm going to have the proceeding according to the complaint here." She actually, according to the details here, advised them to sit in the jury box, which some people thought was odd. And as you mentioned, Jill, led them through this private door where they eventually make their way into the hallway. That's when the agents see him. Apparently, an agent rides in the elevator down with them. They're speaking in Spanish. He then hits it and starts to run out of the courthouse, and they eventually are able to grab him here. Now, as far as the judge is concerned, she isn't commenting, but her lawyer says that she wholeheartedly regrets and protests her arrest. It was not made in the interest of public safety. Among the questions we're going to have here, Jill, is how she explains her actions. They haven't explained exactly why she put them in the jury box, why she led them out that private door. Is she going to have an explanation for another judge on that? Or is the government going to be able to make the case that, no, actually, she was helping him evade arrest here? Now, this isn't the first time immigration agents have showed up in courts. We've seen images like this across the country as ICE under Trump here has become much more aggressive in their arrests and where they're willing to do arrests. There have been several cases of this actually in Wisconsin courtrooms. Now, as far as Flores Ruiz, the undocumented migrant, apparently he was already deported once in 2013. So he came in the country illegally, deported in 2013, somehow made his way into the U.S. again. So this is his second time in the country illegally. And he's been working as a cook, apparently, in Milwaukee for about a decade now. He had no criminal record before these battery and domestic violence charges. But, one of the things that's coming up here is that law enforcement and some judges say we want people who even here illegally to feel like they can come into a courtroom so we can deal with, various crimes, etc., because you can't deport everyone immediately all the time. But the government says, no. As far as we're concerned, we don't really care about any of that stuff. We're here to deport as many people as we can. And if we hear that there's a court case involving an undocumented migrant, we're going to go ahead and do that.
So here's what we know about the judge, Hannah Dugan. She spent a big part of her career providing legal services for poor people, especially specializing in housing and public benefits. She headed up a domestic violence project during her career. She once told a newspaper that, quote, the rule of law is how we address our social issues, how we address our disputes, but also how we grow as people. She became a circuit judge in 2016 in Wisconsin, where judges are elected. She ran unopposed for re-election in 2022, and she's currently serving a term that ends in 2028. She has been described as a by the book kind of judge. She appeared herself in court the other day on the federal charges, and her legal team vowed to contest them. A preliminary hearing on her case is scheduled for May 15th.
Yeah, there's another interesting detail is that she didn't actually end up hearing the Flores Ruiz case. There was supposed to be like a quick kind of hearing on that. And she ended up adjourning that without telling everyone in the courtroom, which I hear from some people who work in this business that that's weird. I hear from other people that that is not abnormal. Nonetheless, there were people in the courtroom waiting for that proceeding who were like, wait, what happened to him? Where did he go? Are you going to have the proceeding? And they're like, oh, no, she adjourned that case as far as we're concerned today. So again, another thing she's going to have to explain at that either preliminary hearing or subsequent hearings, as now this federal case into her continues. A reminder again that he's been arrested, and so we'll keep up to date on his potential deportation as well. There is, again, precedence for this. It actually happened in the first Trump administration when they arrested a Massachusetts judge named Shelley Joseph. At the time, she was indicted for allegedly directing an undocumented migrant to avoid an ICE arrest through a basement. Now, that case ended with a deal. She referred herself to judicial discipline. Charges were dropped against her and said she would, learn from the experience. Nonetheless, you have Republicans applauding the move here. You have Democrats very concerned, saying judicial independence is under attack here. Judges are going to be scared to make any decisions that go against the Trump administration's agenda. Again, you have the White House and DOJ saying, no, it's not all judges. It's this judge and how she handled this case that's at issue here. Nonetheless, Democrats are very concerned about this. The governor of Wisconsin, this took place in Wisconsin, he came out saying that the Trump administration is using dangerous rhetoric to attack and undermine our judiciary at every level. There was a protest outside an FBI office in Milwaukee over the weekend. People chanting immigrants are here to stay, liberty and justice for all. State officials saying that this is unchecked executive power. And so, we've talked about the various challenges and pushback, especially as the administration has taken a very aggressive stance on deportations and illegals here. And so ultimately, this is another example of what the administration calls an activist judge. And they say it's not enough to do a slap on the wrist here. Like they went with a full arrest here, and they want to set an example that they expect everyone, including judges, to cooperate with the feds on all things deportation.
Okay, now to some international stories. First, in the Middle East, a huge explosion ripped through Iran's largest and most important commercial port, killing at least 40 people and injuring more than 800 others on Saturday. Authorities are linking the disaster to a shipment of chemicals used to create missile propellant. The blast erupted at the Shahid Rajia port in Bandar Abbas, which is a critical shipping hub on the Strait of Hormuz. Images show a mushroom cloud of black and orange smoke. A security firm attributed the explosion to, quote, improper handling of a shipment of solid fuel intended for use in Iranian ballistic missiles. In March, the port took in a shipment of rocket fuel, part of a shipment from China. That fuel was going to be used to replenish Iran's missile stocks, which had been depleted by its direct attacks on Israel.
Yeah, remember those back and forth with the Israelis. Also, the Israelis took out a bunch of Iranian missiles, so they needed to refuel and rebuild. But apparently, they continue to store this fuel, even though it's been at the port for a while, leading to a lot of questions inside Iran as to why they exactly did that. This does bear a resemblance, Jill, to the 2020 port explosion in Beirut. Some of you may remember that massive explosion killed more than 200, injured thousands of people there in Beirut. They're still rebuilding things years later after that. In this case, what was interesting is Iran took responsibility here. Oftentimes they like to blame things on Israel or the U.S., sabotage, attack. But it appears here they were pretty quick to say, nope, it appears someone was not storing things in the right place here. And I bring up the, blame because it wasn't that long ago, actually 5 years ago, the Israelis launched a major cyber attack on this exact port that really shut down operations, really hurt things there. Ultimately here, what's interesting, at least for now, the Iranians are like, no, this was an internal screw up. even though it's very convenient for the Israelis here because the Iranians, this puts them further behind in replenishing their missile supply.
Meanwhile, the U.S. and Iran concluded their third round of nuclear talks over the weekend with less enthusiasm about a future deal this time, although a senior U.S. official called them positive and productive. It was the first time the two countries dove into the technical aspects of a new nuclear deal, especially the limitations the U.S. wants to impose on Iran's nuclear program and the sanctions that Iran wants the U.S. to lift. So these, again, much more difficult conversations. Moshe, as the expression goes, the devil is in the details here. An Iranian official said that he was cautious about reaching a deal, and there remained areas where the two countries are still far off from each other. The talks reportedly lasted for 4 hours and included direct and indirect conversations between the U.S. and Iranian teams. They are still planning to meet again next week in Europe.
So the Iranians and U.S. officials still pretty divided on the fundamental details of an agreement, something we've been telling you on this podcast, despite kind of the generic optimism that you heard from the president and others. Ultimately here, what the U.S. is looking for Iran to do and what Iran is willing to do here, still very different. The Iranians say they have a peaceful nuclear program and they're willing to potentially strike a deal on enriching uranium or preventing themselves from enriching uranium to get to weapons-grade material. But who inspects that? And what about everything else? Their support for terror groups around the region, their missile program, other issues that Trump in the past has said are major problems and is the reason he pulled out of the last deal. Right now, and I was talking to some folks this weekend who are pretty close to the talks in Washington. Right now, they say that Trump isn't even getting as much as Obama got in the deal that Trump criticized. So still a lot here to negotiate about in regards to uranium, in regards to the deal here. Trump, again, wants a stronger deal. The Iranians appear are like only willing to do a weaker deal. The talks will continue next Saturday.
And on a different front, President Trump's also looking to open up talks with another longtime adversary, North Korea. There are reports that the Trump administration has been holding discussions and consulting outside experts while it considers potentially restarting talks with the country. That is according to a senior U.S. official and 3 additional sources who spoke to Axios. President Trump and Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un held 2 dramatic but ultimately failed summits during his first term. Now Trump has said he would like to reconnect with Kim. A senior U.S. official tells Axios, quote, "A lot has changed in the last 4 years. We are evaluating, diagnosing, and talking about potential avenues, including engagement." So it's basically discussions about those potential discussions. They've involved think tank experts and current and former U.S. officials. That being said, experts say the North Koreans have not expressed any interest in negotiating with the Americans. A former senior U.S. official telling Axios that their willingness to engage would depend on the nature of the conversation.
And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again. I'm a rocket man.
The Rocket Man.
Remember when Trump was calling him Rocket Man back like early first term? We legitimately were concerned about us going to war with Kim Jong-un at that time. He was calling him Little Rocket Man, because he's little and likes to launch rockets. And so, one of the obvious nicknames that the president's come up with for people. And then ultimately led to those summits. Jill, I was at that second summit in Vietnam, in Hanoi, that actually ended early because they had no deal. So we were expecting there, I think, to be there a couple extra days. And they're like, nope, Kim Jong-un has gone home. Trump is leaving. There will be no press conference. We have nothing to do here anymore. And that's how things ended. And when was I there? In 2019. So what was that? 6 years ago. And so we'll see what happens. But ultimately, what is up for debate here? The difference between the North Koreans and the Iranians, and this is not lost on the Iranians, by the way, is North Korea has nukes, nuclear weapons. They tested their first nuke back in 2006. They've built a small arsenal for themselves. They're the latest, most recent nuclear weapons power in the world. And they're not going to give up their nuclear weapons because that's Lil Kim's ticket to lifetime in power, and then his kids taking over, and then his grandkids taking over, and ensuring that no one invades him because he legitimately says he would use nukes before he would give up power.
And we believe him. That doesn't feel that far-fetched.
No, I mean, the man literally shoots missiles over South Korea and Japan. And if there was a mess up, they would fall. He aims them over the island to freak people out over in Japan. And luckily they've all flown over Japan and into the ocean. So yeah, that's the thing about Kim, is that people take him seriously, that he would actually bring, he would blow them all up. in order to try to stay in power here. And remember that like his grandfather was the leader, his father was the leader, and like nukes were their ticket to like a lifetime in power, which by the way is something the Iranians think about. That Iranian regime that runs things there, they also have a hot debate as to whether if they actually had the nuclear weapons, no one could ever push them out of power or threaten a nuclear war. So, as far as talks here with the North Koreans, it's not clear what would be achieved. I think what Kim Jong Un is looking for is a recognition that he is a nuclear power. There's this whole status of nuclear powers where there's official nuclear powers. Then there's people you sort of know have nukes, but they won't admit it. That's Israel. Then you have North Korea, which has nukes, but nobody wants to recognize them as like an official nuclear power because we want them to like give up their nukes. And he wants to be up there with India, the U.S., Russia, France, where he gets to legitimately have nukes. Is that up for debate? I'm not clear as far as Trump is concerned. One of the other issues he's going to have, Jill, the only country that can really exert pressure on Kim Jong-un is China. We're not in a great place with China right now. China ain't doing us any favors right now. And they were the ones who were really putting pressure on Kim Jong-un the first time, being like, cut it out, Kim. Like, otherwise, we'll cut you off. And like, North Korea depends on China for basically everything, for life. It's their border. You put stuff over that border. And, they're basically kind of the godfather to North Korea. And North Korea is sort of like the pain in the ass nephew that they sort of have to manage. But China just wants Kim to behave. But China's not in the business of doing any favors for Donald Trump right now, which would make talks with North Korea very difficult.
Well, we know Steve Witkoff has a lot on his plate. So hopefully these talks will at least wait until the Russia-Ukraine talks are wrapped up. The Iran talks are wrapped up. We've got him negotiating between Hamas and Israel. So he's a busy guy.
Yeah, Witkoff, he flies private, but if he flew an airline, he'd have amazing frequent flyer miles right now. Like he would definitely have gotten himself an incredible vacation. But I mean, we kid, but like, Trump likes his negotiating style. He likes this guy. He's a real estate guy, like no diplomatic experience, but he sends them to Putin, sends them to Iran, sends them to Hamas. So, why not add Kim Jong-un? Or maybe you give Marco Rubio a chance because he's, Secretary of State and all. He's sort of he's been playing like sort of second fiddle to Witkoff in recent weeks, and that's something that came up in Washington when I was there for the weekend as well.
Oh, that's so interesting. Is there reporting that Rubio is actually feeling slighted by this?
There is. He denies it. He denies it. He says no. There's a lot of things to go on there's a lot of things going on in the world, and I have a lot to do here at the State Department, and he's the one managing Ukraine while Witkoff handles Russia. Nonetheless, you don't typically, those sort of primo negotiating slots. Remember, in the last administration, it was Tony Blinken, right? But even Tony Blinken, as Secretary of State, he couldn't handle all negotiations. They had the CIA director handling some of them too. So you do need to divide and conquer. But, if you gave Rubio truth serum, he would admit that I'm sure there's negotiations he would like to have that Witkoff is having right now.
All right, time for the speed read from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or the CBC. A tragedy in Vancouver over the weekend. 11 people have died. Dozens more were injured in a car ramming attack at a street festival in Vancouver on Saturday night. The victims range in age from just 5 years old to 65. A 30-year-old Vancouver resident is in custody. He is facing multiple second-degree murder charges. More charges are expected. Police say the suspect has an extensive history of interactions with police and mental health professionals. They describe that history as including mental health-related incidents. Officials say they do not believe that his motives include terrorism, which they define as, quote, some political, religious ideation behind it. The incident occurred at a block party to celebrate a Filipino hero and Filipino heritage. The driver rammed an SUV into large crowds at the festival just after it had ended as the cleanup was happening.
Now, police are saying that it didn't look like he was specifically trying to target Filipino people, even though that was the nature of the festival. There are immigrant communities right now in Canada that are feeling unsafe as this has happened. Jill, just the latest one of these car ramming attacks. We've seen them all around the world. We talked about the one in New Orleans just after New Year's, where an ISIS flag was discovered on the car. There have been multiple incidents like this in Germany as well. The details here are just, so unfortunate. It's believed that he made his way onto a busy roadway, according to witnesses. They were in cleanup mode. They were opening up the roadway to traffic again after the festival as they continued cleanup, and cars were driving through. This guy, though, was allowed to drive through and then hit the gas and tragically killed a number of people injured more. As we talk about Canada, a lot of focus on Canada today and the coming days, as today is Canadian Election Day. So this was, very much a distraction this weekend. Some politicians were not campaigning over the weekend after this took place. The big race we're watching in Canada is who's going to be the next prime minister. We have been watching it on Instagram over on Premium over the weekend. We have a cheat sheet we put together in the newsletter on Friday, so you can check that out over at mo.news. So you get a sense of who's running, what's at stake here, how the political system works. A reminder that Canada has a multi-party system. It's not a two-party system like here in the U.S., but ultimately, this time around, it is really coming down to the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. The Liberal Party has been in charge for nearly a decade. Justin Trudeau, who was in charge for a long time, became very unpopular, resigned in January, sort of pulled what Biden should have pulled in his party, gave his party a chance to elect a new leader, that is Mark Carney. And so now Mark Carney is facing the conservative Pierre Poilievre, as well as some other third-party candidates. And it's super close. It's fascinating because Trump and the U.S. are really center stage here for the Canadian election, among other issues. It really is a debate about who can challenge the president, the U.S. president, most effectively in regards to tariffs, in regards to his threats to make Canada a 51st state. For a while, Jill, the Conservatives were going to crush it. Then Trudeau resigns. Trump starts threatening Canada. The Liberals then take a major lead. Now it is a very close race going into today. And so we'll see what the results are tonight and tomorrow, because the Conservatives have been able to pull back in here as Trump has been the conversation. But there are other issues in Canada the Conservatives are pulling better on, like cost of living and the need for change. And so those are the results we'll be watching tonight.
All right, from NBC News, former New York Congressman George Santos sentenced to more than 7 years in federal prison on Friday for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He sobbed in court while the judge handed down his sentence. The 36-year-old pleaded guilty last summer, admitting to deceiving donors and stealing the identities of nearly a dozen individuals to inflate his campaign contributions. He also agreed to pay nearly $600,000 in penalties related to the charges. Santos, if you remember, was expelled from Congress in 2023 after just 1 year in office. It followed a 23-count indictment that included charges of wire fraud, identity theft, falsification of records, credit card fraud, and more. After Santos was elected, it emerged that he had fabricated pretty much his entire background, falsely claiming to be a volleyball star, a Wall Street financier, that his family had fled Europe because of the Holocaust, that a family member also survived the attacks on September 11th.
Lie, and lie.
A House ethics investigation found that Santos spent campaign funds on Botox, designer fashion, cosmetics, and OnlyFans.
One of the issues here, Jill, is that prosecutors were able to argue as part of the sentencing that he remains unrepentant. He literally has a podcast called Pants on Fire. If you go to his Twitter account, he calls himself George Santos Pants on Fire, like liar, liar, pants on fire. Jill, apparently, despite sobbing in the courtroom, he then was on social media over the weekend doing fashion reviews of people on the White House Correspondents' Dinner red carpet, reviewing dresses and makeup and people's looks. He also wrote over the weekend that he has judicial obligations and doesn't have time for sobbing and pouting, despite facing 7 years in prison. He did ask Trump to pardon him in a tweet over the weekend. It is not clear that the president has any reason, while he's been doling out pardons and stuff. There's nothing really Santos can do for him. I don't know if there's a net plus here for Trump to do that. Eric Adams made sense because Eric Adams is the sitting mayor of New York, and there's a cooperation that could be helpful there. In the case of Santos, I don't know why Trump would do this. Wouldn't be surprised if somehow it, came to pass at some point, but ultimately it looks unlikely. And so he's got a few more weeks of freedom, Jill, before your ex-congressman goes to jail.
I will say it was a debate among some people that I was chatting with this weekend. 7 years just sounded like a lot.
Yeah.
Even though that's what the law calls for, it just seems like, wow. I don't know how much of it he's actually going to serve, but 7 years is a long time behind bars.
Yeah. Well, Jill, if you need help processing it as someone born and raised in Illinois, 4 of our last 10 governors went to prison, Blagojevich being one of them. So I'm happy to help you process it. If you need,
I'm okay.
If you're struggling,
I haven't lost any sleep over it. Sleeping like a baby, Moshe. From CNN, Pope Francis was laid to rest over the weekend. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered to celebrate his life on Saturday in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. Guests included some of the world's most powerful leaders, as well as members of society's marginalized groups, whom Pope Francis always made a point to minister to, including migrants. Pope Francis's public viewing drew about 250,000 people to Vatican City. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re read a homily during Pope Francis's funeral and remembered how the pontiff would conclude his speeches and meetings saying, "Do not forget to pray for me." The cardinal asked for the Pope's prayers one more time. Pope Francis is the first pontiff in more than a century to be buried outside of the Vatican. In his last will, he asked to be buried in the Basilica of St. Mary Major. The church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. On Saturday, his coffin was transferred to its final resting place near an icon of the Madonna that he had revered, reflecting his commitment to humility and simplicity. He also requested to have a simple tomb.
All right, Jill, some incredible photos from the event, all the red, the crowds of people, and just, the most powerful people in the world all attending that event. We had former President Biden and President Trump there, prime ministers, sheikhs, the King of England, a whole variety of folks. And it was interesting because Trump and Zelensky took time before the funeral began. They set up 2 chairs in the middle of a part of the Vatican there to have a meeting. And remember, this is their first face-to-face since that infamous meeting in the Oval Office where Trump booted him after that fight that they had. As far as the recaps for both sides, words like good and productive were used, positive words. So it appears, Zelensky said the right stuff, at least in that 15 minutes. There's also a photo showing Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, of Macron of France, talking to Zelensky and Trump after or before that session as well. And it does come this weekend as Trump publicly is expressing frustration with Vladimir Putin. Over the weekend, he criticized Putin again for his continuous attacks on Ukraine, deadly attacks in Ukraine. Over the weekend, he said, too many people are dying. Was Vladimir Putin just tapping me along? That's what Ukraine's been saying to Donald Trump. So the fact that Trump is saying this now publicly, very frustrated with Putin, is very interesting because effectively, I think, as you look at what was being offered here is this deal that Ukraine's been rejecting and Putin hasn't really accepted. It's a pretty good deal for the Russians. He gets to keep all of Crimea. He gets to keep basically all the land that he took from Ukraine the last 3 years. Ukraine doesn't get to join NATO. The U.S. isn't going to put security on the ground there. And I think the assumption from the White House was like, why would Putin, we'll make a deal quickly. Putin gets everything basically that he wants here. But no, Vlad wants more. And so I think Trump's frustrated that Putin won't take the deal here. It appears Zelensky has made amends and he's feeling good about him. So we'll see what happens there. And just to end things here on the Pope again, since we're talking about the funeral and the aftermath, we are awaiting the exact start date of the conclave to decide who the next Pope is going to be, to elect the next Pope. That could start as soon as next Tuesday, the 6th. There is a meeting this morning at the Vatican amongst the 100 plus cardinals who are there, where we may hear in the next 24, 48 hours when the conclave will start. And so at some point next week, they'll begin the very private meetings to vote on the next pope.
From Fox News, a speech getting a lot of attention at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington this weekend. During the event, a political reporter called out himself and the media as he was receiving an award in front of a couple of thousand fellow reporters and Washington elites Saturday night. Axios' Alex Thompson criticized the press corps for missing signs of President Biden's decline ahead of the June 2024 debate.
President Biden's decline and its cover-up by the people around him is a reminder that every White House, regardless of party, is capable of deception. But being truth tellers also means telling the truth about ourselves. We, myself included, missed a lot of this story, and some people trust us less because of it. We bear some responsibility for faith in the media being at such lows.
He goes on to say that acknowledging errors only builds trust and that being defensive erodes it, reminding us that we live in a time where people are looking for what's true and that the people in power are not telling the truth. He tells the media that they and himself should have done better. Moshe, it was interesting to watch the reaction from members of the media. He got kind of like a polite applause, but I think maybe some mixed reaction.
Yeah, why are you pissing inside the tent, brother? Why are you pissing? Like, sort of what I imagine some people would be thinking of him. It took a lot of courage from Alex to do that, honestly, Jill, because I've been to that dinner since 2007. Like that's a dinner where it's always like rah rah, we're great, yay media, yay First Amendment, like look at all the amazing things that we do. And there's not much in the way of like self reflection. Now, usually they have the comedian who like pokes, fun at the media to a certain extent, some more than others. And by the way, the comedians who have been very aggressive on the media hasn't loved that. Stephen Colbert is a famous example of that years ago. Interesting that Alex, in this year where a lot of focus was on the concern about Donald Trump and some of the moves he's making, including on Friday, interestingly, Jill, he's rescinding a Biden provision, Biden's DOJ, his attorney general, who's running the Justice Department, Merrick Garland, and the media actually came to a deal where they would not seize reporters' records in criminal investigations. Trump made the call, by the way, not coincidentally, on Friday ahead of this dinner to rescind that policy, meaning in certain cases, in certain investigations, it may mean in a leak investigation, the Justice Department will subpoena notes, subpoena sources, anonymous sources from the media. And remember, some of the biggest scoops in history, whether it's Watergate or various things during the Bush administration with NSA wiretapping, came through anonymous sources. So there's concern in the media generally about that, and that was a lot of the conversation over the weekend. So back to Alex Thompson here, the fact that he's like, we should look back at what we failed at during the Biden administration. Did we bring the aggressiveness we bring to Trump to Biden? Short answer, no. And I think there's a lot of people in the media who sort of just want to move on from all of that or want to point the finger at the people around the president. There's certainly blame to go around, right? The people around the president, we now increasingly know, and his book is going to be out next month with Jake Tapper, Alex Thompson, of all people, which is, by the way, some criticism he's getting is that like, well, you're promoting a book about the media's failure during Biden and you gave this speech. Nonetheless, he has sourcing, and his book will likely tell that story about both people around the president hiding the president from the media, but also, did the media go hard enough on that? Did they push hard enough when the president was being hidden from the media and not answering questions and not doing press conferences and all the things the media likes to go at Republicans for, but didn't, I would say, go hard enough on Biden for? So fascinating that Thompson went there, and very clearly you hear in a room of about 2,000 people, it was definitely not, there were no roars or like, standing ovations as far as we're concerned there. Sort of like, hey, Alex, can we talk about this not in front of the cameras?
Awkward. I think it just wasn't where they thought he was going to go with it. I mean, their conversation.
No, because he was accepting an award for his coverage. But by the way, do you know what his coverage was? Alex was one of the only reporters over at Axios. He was like calling out. He's like, they changed a policy where Biden doesn't walk up the steps of Air Force One, the normal steps. He walks up the short steps at the back of the plane. Biden doesn't walk to Marine One by himself anymore. He walks with a group of people. So you don't see how he's, kind of walking like an old man. He noted that like they changed the shoes Biden was wearing from dress shoes to like, sort of old man sneakers so he wouldn't trip. I will say, and he acknowledges he probably could have done more, but he was one of the few people who was actually observing these things and would take the wrath of the White House, the Biden White House, for reporting those things. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1967. Muhammad Ali, the champ, refused to be drafted on this day in history in 1967 on religious grounds. He didn't want to go to war in Vietnam. He was convicted of draft evasion, and he lost his boxing title. Speaking of Vietnam, on this day in 1970, President Richard Nixon gives his formal authorization to commit U.S. combat troops to fight in Cambodia, neighboring Cambodia, beyond Vietnam. When he publicly announced this, it set off a wave of anti-war protests that were already, happening across the country. This sort of took things to a new level. The feeling that Nixon was expanding the war even further at a time where Americans wanted out of the war. Just days after this announcement, the infamous, tragic protest at Kent State University would take place, where Army National Guard troops would kill 4 students. On this day in 2004, 60 Minutes reports the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq. The report featured graphic photographs showing U.S. military personnel torturing and abusing prisoners. It greatly tarnished the Bush administration, the war in Iraq at that point. Jill, we were talking about 60 Minutes last week and like impact that it's had. And you sort of have to go back to the Abu Ghraib story, 2004, for like the last time 60 Minutes really kind of changed the national conversation and had a breakthrough story. So notable on this day in history 21 years ago today.
Right. It basically changed policy in a lot of ways. It changed the public's perception of the war. And just shocking.
And perception of the U.S., and frankly gave also a lot of inspiration to the insurgency and the groups that would form out of that, ISIS, etc. So a lot would come out of there. Remember, ISIS for years would dress up their prisoners like we dressed up prisoners at Gitmo, and oftentimes Abu Ghraib and the abuse and torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib was invoked. All right, some lighter items here as we head into music and pop culture. On this day in 1979, Heart of Glass by Blondie reaches #1 on the Billboard charts. On this day in 2003, Apple launches the iTunes Store, giving us the ability to purchase and download music through the iTunes library. Jill, this is a game changer for those of us that were waiting overnight with LimeWire and Kazaa and Napster and hoping the feds wouldn't arrest us for illegally downloading music.
Right. Then now this is what we call Music 2001 that crashed my computer at least once.
Right. I mean, people forget this. There was a time where no one's going to pay for music. We so got used to downloading music for free online. And, Steve Jobs, now, again, they were getting paid, a fraction of what they were getting paid for CDs and albums before, but sort of began the sort of re-legitimizing paying for music again in the digital space and organizing it. This is in the sort of pre-Pandora, pre-Spotify era, pre-streaming era, but a game changer, one of the many game changers Apple has brought to technology and our culture in recent decades. All right, on this day in 2001, the first space tourist, Dennis Tito, took flight. And speaking of space tourists, Jill, on this day in 2008, Katy Perry, before she became a space tourist, released her song 17 years ago today, I Kissed a Girl, and I liked it.
Oh, how far she's come, Moshe.
She's gone to space and back, Jill.
All right, Moshe, that is a wrap of this Monday podcast. I'm glad you are back in New York. You survived all things White House Correspondents' Dinner. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And please review us kindly in the App Store. We appreciate it.
Yeah, especially if you should all review us kindly, except if Kim Jong-un is listening. He probably did not appreciate me calling him Little Rocket Man again.
And singing it.
But you think Kim, that'd be super cool if Kim listened to this podcast, but I don't think he does.
The publicity we would get from a bad review from the North Korean leader.
I take it. Somebody get to Kim. Get this podcast to Kim.
All right, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.